Thank you very much. I want to begin with a picture of the world, the way I look at the world. I look at the world as globes, these globes of floating currency areas, optimum currency areas maybe. The size of the circles, the area of the circles represents GDP, more or less GDP, or if you like, monetary power. Real money balance is more exactly, more or less proportionate to GDP. So the U.S. is at the center with about $15 trillion. On the right is the euro area with about 13 trillion. And then number 3 in the world is China with about 6.5 to 7, going on 7 trillion. And then the RMB, the Japanese yen, is the number 4 currency area with about 5 trillion. And then much smaller areas, like the British pound, about 2.8 trillion, something like that. And then smaller countries. My country, Canada, is somewhere in there. Russia and Brazil and so on. But the important thing to notice is that in terms of major currencies, what really counts in the world is the dollar and the euro area and the RMB and the Japanese yen. Those 4 currency areas, and also the pound sterling has to be put into it. Pound in the 19th century was the most important currency in the world, and until it was replaced by the dollar around after World War I. So I'm not going to talk about that right now. I'm going to start off with the dollar, but I'll come back to the world situation again and see why I brought that out at the beginning. I want to start off with saying that going back 30 years, it's long enough now, 3 long booms that we have, and this puts the context right. And from the U.S. standpoint, it was closely mirrored by the world, but of course different things were happening in other parts. But the first great boom was from 1982 to 90. This was the 7 fat years, so-called, of the Reagan administration. And the important part of that, the 1980s period, was that the Reagan administration had to stop a rapid inflation of about 13.5% that it inherited in 1980. And it got it down by 1984 to about 4%, which was a great achievement at the same time. But it caused a recession at the beginning, and the important thing that took place in there was a complete revolution in the tax system, cutting of tax rates down from in the federal level alone from 70% when Reagan took office, and 28% in the top bracket, the highest bracket, when Reagan left office, and that set the whole tone to the next decade. So because we're still in the next 2 decades still inheriting those tax rates, because even though they went up in the Clinton administration and down a little bit in the Bush administration, they're still very, very different from what they were any time before 1980. That boom came to an end with a painful recession. A recession, I think of it as largely a recession where the computer and the internet came along and replaced about 1 tier of middle management. And it was a serious recession in the United States because it laid off a lot of people in their later years, like in their 40s. Middle management was knocked out, and that made it and slow recovery to it was quite slow. But it was only a 9-month recession. Then the recovery started again, but it was a painful one. And then the second boom started again 9 months after the recession had come, and that through the Bush and then the Clinton administration, all the way through. It was the longest boom in American history, a 10-year expansion before, and that included the Silicon Valley IT revolution and the internet, development of the internet and all the great companies that have become world famous, a complete revolution in the information technology industry. And that came in with the dot-com, they call it a bubble because a lot of companies failed, but the big companies, the successful companies, continued on and are with us today. But that ended in 2001, and then a recession for about a year, and then recovery again started. And this next third expansion, not as long as the second one. This we could call it the Clinton expansion, Bush-Clinton expansion, 10-year expansion. But the third expansion started in 2002 and went on to 2008. But this expansion was shorter than the other one, but this was the most magnificent maybe in world history. Shorter, but magnificent, because all the countries of the world were involved in this expansion. This was the period after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, the new restructuring that took place, new countries coming on, and the decade of the 1990s was a tough decade for those transition countries, going from the Soviet system into the other, into a private system. But then they started to become great, and then in the 2002 period, 2008, all the major economies were moving ahead strongly. And that, I think, was the greatest period ever in expansion world history. But that came to an end. We have to look at it a little bit. I don't have much time to talk about it, but I want to talk about that a little bit. In a way, housing was the big, strong push, and all kinds of innovations were going on to expand the supply of savings from the world, the bundling together of mortgages, and everybody was bundling these into what people thought were AAA securities. It turned out that a lot of them were bogus securities. They were bad housing assets by mortgages of people who were failing, and it turned out to have a lot of holes in it. But the expansion was a very great one, and it was a period of large deficits in the United States. But these deficits of the United States were supplying the rest of the world with liquidity, because the dollar was the major currency of the world, and this was feeding the world. So the housing, anyway, it overexpanded, and the housing market started to turn down in 2006. And it was wildly coasting along. The economy coasted along into 2008. The dollar was going down low in that period. And that low dollar against the euro was creating, for countries that kept their currencies tied to the dollar, creating some inflationary pressure in Asia, China, and in Hong Kong, Macau. There was before, but then came the big crash of 2008. We have to see what that was. First, there was, with the subprime mortgage crisis, this earlier thing was because of the toxic assets that suddenly became on the balance sheets of a lot of banks, and there was a great demand for liquidity in Europe. It started in Europe. It was tremendous. And the European Central Bank, on one day, August the 9th, 2007, issued 95 billion euros, about $140 billion of new money in one day. Never before had numbers like that appeared. Now, I have to say that just after Christmas, there was an even more magnificent expansion that topped that off by about 5 times. $490 billion of lending in one day by the European Central Bank in late December. And that was just mind-boggling, because that averted in advance, that preempted what would have been a big liquidity crisis inside Europe, and it made the European situation as bad as it still is today. It would have been much, much worse without that preemptive action by Mario Draghi, the new head of the European Central Bank. Now, so the 3 phases of the crisis: subprime mortgage crisis, and altogether about $300 billion in those 2 days by all the central banks to avert that liquidity crisis. That gave banks enough liquidity so they didn't have to quickly adjust to these bad assets on their balance sheet and suddenly cut off all lending. That allowed them to slow things down and adjust things. But then after that, that was the subprime mortgage crisis. 2008 was not a subprime mortgage crisis in the same thing at all. It was something different that happened. What happened in 2008, you've got all the housing institutions in the United States were in trouble in September. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, they were bailed out by the government because they were government-sponsored institutions in part, and the government bailed. They would have been bankrupt, but they bailed out. But then when Lehman Brothers, a private sector bank, started in 1865, one of the oldest banks in the world. The modern world, it collapsed, and they didn't save it. It was a mistake not to save it, because along with this came all kinds of other things that were. But you have to ask the question of why with the liquidity crisis solved in 2007, why did it take a whole year for the Lehman crash and all the crashes of these? What was the thing that something else happened? And then the economic contraction that started at the same time. Now, I'm not going to mention. I mentioned the subprime mortgage crisis. These are the amount of this. But this is the important thing. So it's the U.S. error. The U.S. let the dollar appreciate in the summer of 2008. The euro was $1.64 in June. And at that rate, the United States inflation rate was 5.5% annualized, a pretty high inflation rate. And the Fed tightened over that period, and they let the dollar soar. And it soared, so the euro dropped from $1.64 down to $1.23 in October. That was the period people in Hong Kong and Macau, and as well as China, would recognize, because when the dollar was soaring against the euro, so was the Hong Kong dollar and the Macau, and the RMB was, all of these were soaring, and that's when China, in the summer, instead of expanding exports by 20%, exports went down by 20%. Never before in 15 or 20 years had that happened. So this was the big mistake that was due to the wrong policy on the Fed. They allowed that to happen. There were a lot of other things that went down. The price of gold went down from about $250, and the U.S. inflation rate went down to 0 at the end of the year and to minus 2% in the first part of 2009. So tight money was a big mistake, and that was a big problem for all the countries fixed to the dollar, because that tight money brought the recession over to those countries. So all these things were happening. Oil prices had gone up to $148 and went down to an unheard of level to $33 a barrel. From $148 to $33 in that greatest deflation period in history. I won't go into it too much. I just want to make it clear that there are all kinds of evidence to show the price of raw materials were going way down, and the U.S. inflation rate and the dollar was soaring. It was the U.S. was not controlling the inflation. This is what was happening to the cost of living index. Finally, in March of this period, over around this period, or by March, Bernanke sort of suddenly announced that, we're getting deflation. We're getting deflation, as if he wasn't watching it. When he did his thesis at MIT, he was pushing for inflation targeting in the United States, but he wasn't doing it here, because here there's too much inflation, and now this was deflation going on. And this is what brought on the long, slow period in the bad economy. Now, turn now to Europe. I've mentioned that. Europe, the strong dollar, weak euro in 2008 meant that the recession hit the U.S. before Europe. The Europeans were saying, we're not, in the fall of 2008, they were saying, Europe U.S. is having this, but this is a U.S. problem, not a European problem, because the dollar was very high, and that was bringing the problem here, and the euro was low, and that was helping the problem there. Whenever the euro is low, fiscal situation is always much better. And but then when it turned around again, then Europe started to get the problem, and the big basic lack of exports of the southern countries of Europe is creating problems for Europe. So the recession shifted to Europe as the dollar started to go down again, and then that aggravated the fiscal situation. But you had to look at this. To understand the fiscal situation, you have to understand that this is not a phenomenon, a recent phenomenon. It's a build-up, a long-term build-up of a European social revolution. After World War II, the economies of Europe didn't have much in the way of what we would call socialism, big social welfare programs. They didn't have very much of that. But after 2 decades of recovery, in Italy, for instance, Italy had the largest communist party outside of the Soviet Union. I guess we should say outside of this. In 1945, Italy had the largest communist party outside the Soviet Union. And then, although I don't know whether China is counted, whether we're counting China in that or not, but it's certainly in Europe. And so the centrist parties and socialist parties implemented the communist agenda. The communists never came to power, but the pressure was always pushing, and the socialist parties were pushing an agenda, and eventually there was a big increase in government spending. Here you can see this, and this was affecting particularly the poorer part of Europe, which was Southern Europe. Italy was a poor country in 1945, 1948. Now, then it became a rich country, and it adopted the habits and spending policies of rich countries. But countries like Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, these were rather poor countries relative to the north. Now this, I don't know if you can see that, this shows just to show this revolution in government spending, which is so fundamental. In Germany, it was 1963 and then 1993. Germany, 30%, government spending as a share of GDP in 1963, and in 1993, 3 decades later, 48%, 46.6%. I guess let me get the pointer here. I can see it better over here. From here. And in France, 33 to 51%. Suddenly, this is a revolution. 16 or 17 percentage points increase in the share of government spending in GDP, largely through social welfare programs, pensions and medical systems and everything else like that. But now, look, that's for these 2 countries. This is big enough, but the big problem was what happened to these countries. Much poorer on average. Well, Italy was growing and became richer, but these countries had about 1/3 the per capita income of the European countries, of Germany and France. And look, from very low, because poor countries can't have high levels of government spending, too much, 18%, but this shot up to 45% in Greece. And now it's 53%. It's 53% now because it kept on going, and 17% to 42%, 18 to 42% in Spain. And compared to the United States, well, same thing happening, but 27% to 34%, much less. In Japan, 13.6 to 26%. In Japan, it's a very successful economy, but you can see they did not engage in huge spendings on the welfare state spendings. So that now I put yes, you have those 2 countries but this is what the background problem of the European crisis was, and you can't understand it without seeing that big increase that took place, that revolution in spending. It was the welfare state, the implementation of the welfare state. I've been saying a long time. I wrote something about this in the 1990s that this is going to be a real problem for Europe. And they're overshooting the welfare state, and people began to realize that and began to slow it down, slow the increase down, but it was too late, and this crisis just revealed all of a sudden, faster than people realized, that they'd overshot the level. So then public debts as a percent because that was spending, but taxation could never rise to that level. Just look, for instance, at Greece. This is take Greece, and here, I turned the wrong thing. Greece, in 1965, taxes relative to GDP, 17.8%. By 1985, they'd gone up to 25.5%, but spending had soared much beyond that, and up to 31%. But you see, spending was 45% to 50% over that period. And you have the U.S. was in better shape over this period because of 24, 25, and they stayed constant, and you didn't get that huge increase in spending in the United States. Now you've got it now, and you've got a 50% increase in the public debt in the United States since President Obama took office. So you've got a huge increase in the public debt in the United States. So the United States is no longer as good in a dangerous position to storing up problems for it. But the U.S. has some extra advantages than Europe does at the moment. So Greek spending surged between 2005 and 2009, after being already high, got to 52% from 47%. And Greek debt, which had been 110% of GDP when Greece joined the Eurozone, just soared in this crisis to 300%, to 180% at one point. And now they've cut it back with the big bailout, but that's the thing. Now, the crisis that began in 2008 struck southern European countries particularly hard, which meant their expansions went down, tax revenues went down, their budget deficits. Greece ended up with a 13.6% budget deficit. You can see how that much is adding to the public debt and so on. So those countries were producing labor-intensive goods, facing increasing difficulties to compete to get back into the markets, and they have to face the competition from much more efficient Asian countries, particularly China. So to a certain extent, China's entry into the world here from 1978, China had half of 1% of world exports, and now China is getting up to 8%, 9%, so on, growing increases, and that comes at the share of countries that produce goods similar to the labor-intensive goods that China does. So is there a risk to Europe in this? Well, it's a common mistake to confuse the debt crisis in Greece and other Eurozone members with the crisis of the euro. The euro is in fine shape, actually. The euro celebrated its 10th anniversary in 2009, and it was generally pronounced a great success. The fact is that the euro is in better shape now than it was when it started. You know, when the U.S. euro started, it was $1.18. And then it went in the tank. There was a lot of people who didn't like it. They were selling euro. They thought it would go way down, and it went down to 82 cents. That was the all-time low of the euro in 2001, 82 cents. But then it recovered, and since 2002, it's only rarely gone back down to lower than it was at $1.18. And in the last while, the average has been more like above $1.30. Now, that's the problem. So it's been a great success, and in 1999, instantly upon its creation, it replaced the yen as the #2 currency in the world. The yen was the #2 currency in the world, and then the euro was euro replaced as #2. The yen became #3. And soon the Chinese the pound sterling was in there at one point, but Chinese currency came in #4. And then a couple of years ago, China replaced the yen as the China's RMB replaced the yen as the number 3 currency in the world. And that's now. What are the risks then? Well, it should be acknowledged right now that. You can ask, is Greece going to default? Well, Greece is already defaulted de facto. It may not be 100% default, maybe 75% default. So it's a very substantial default. And even after this partial default, it's extremely unlikely that Greece will be able to come back to the markets. And nobody can see ahead Greece balancing its budget. It's very hard to see where that's going to come about. It's not going there because Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal aren't doing the major things that created the problem in the first place, which was the overexpansion of the welfare state. It would mean cutting back on entitlements to balance the budget, pensions, medical things that people have been promised. And when you give things to people, the government doesn't give anything to people because it can only do it. It can transfer money from one group of people through taxes and then give it to another group of people. So it's taking from one group of people to another. But that policy reaches an end. It reaches diminishing returns. You can't do it anymore. And it's already done that. It's gone beyond it. But to get back to it, it's very difficult to go back there now because Spain, for instance, had a good, pretty centrist or conservative government, and when they got into the euro for about 8 years, and then they went back to a left-wing government that repeated the mistakes of the earlier period, and then recently that leftist government was thrown out, and a conservative government came in, and they immediately took steps to cut back on some things, small things, not big things, and there were riots in the street. So what is the solution to that? How do you solve it? It becomes a huge social problem when it's a lesson to, certainly it's going to be a lesson to China. So while China is going to have to develop an improved welfare system, it cannot afford to go too far. To go in the direction that Europe went. It would be dangerous if that happened. So but Greece may default because it could turn out that they've lost credibility in terms of the government having the strength to balance it, to keep their commitments. In 2011, they made a commitment to reduce, to fire from the government about 30,000 workers, and they didn't do anything. So it wasn't done, and so they lost credibility. And the next time, I think Greece will be bailed out this time, but maybe not the next time. So then Greece would default completely, but even then, there's no advantage to going back to the euro because creating a drachma wouldn't do any good. Now you can't just devalue; the prices will just shoot up, and you can't change it. It wouldn't be any advantage to. So working within, having the partial defaults, agreed upon defaults within the European IMF context is the best way, the orderly way to default. It's de facto bankruptcy, but there is a group that still favors default and say no more of this. But if the default, then the question is, how does the government pay its bills? How does it pay the pensions? They won't have the money to pay the pensions, and it would be a major problem. So now, if there is a default, and I concede that could be likely, I don't think Greece will leave and create another currency again, because they would see that as shutting itself from all the good things that Europe has brought them. But I don't think that any longer a default in Greece would spread to other countries, because I think firewalls have been created, and so I don't think there's a big danger to Europe from a spread throughout Europe of a crisis that comes from Greece. I think there's enough insulation from it, and there isn't a big impact here. Now, Europe has to get its act together as a whole. In the short run, they need to revive the European economy and a recovery from the current recession. They need to continue to provide support for the weak countries. Certainly, they've got funds now, $500 billion. It'll go up to 1 trillion of our euros for bailouts, and this is needed. And Europe can afford it because Europe is still rich, but Europe needs to improve its capital market. There's a big weakness there in it. Europe would have much more access to global capital if they had a euro area treasury bill and they had a euro area bond. They don't have that. The best asset in the world is right now, liquid asset in the world is the U.S. treasury bill. And the best long-term asset in the world is the U.S. government bond. No other country has a 30-year government bond. And its credibility is indicated by the fact that despite the big deficit problems of the United States, the interest rates are very low that the U.S. has to pay on it. So it's got credibility on it. It's also U.S. also has that extra advantage that its currency is the currency that provides the global currency, and because of this, it gets liquidity advantages that other countries wouldn't have. But Europe needs to compete and become better with a better importance of its capital market. And then the fiscal discipline has to be done. The Growth and Stability Pact was a big failure. Focused too much on deficits. And you have to focus on government spending. Government spending is the key thing, because you can put a ceiling on government spending. It's a budget. Every finance minister has to set a budget, and you have to set tight budgets in the future. And a few years of a tight budget, not much expansion, and it would probably bring Europe back into closer to equilibrium again. They have to do that. They're reluctant to do it because Germany would have to be, and France would have to be controlling the other states, but they couldn't do it. They'd have to impose that discipline on themselves. And remember, Germany has let its own debt GDP ratio go to 82%. It should be 60% was the maximum for the Maastricht Treaty, but Germany's let it go up to 82%. So Germany has been derelict in some ways too. Germany has to restrict its spending. Right. Now, the past was a failure, but you need to do this welfare state, as I've said, is overshot, and without, on the long run, there has to be a cutback, at least a cutback in the growth of the welfare state and a stabilization of it, and eventually a cutting down of it to where Europe can afford it. And then issue the treasury bills, as I mentioned here, and this would give Europe much more liquidity. In the long run, you have to have a shift of sovereignty from the nation state to the central authority. Move toward a genuine U.S. government. I have in my home in Italy, I have a conference on international money every year, and I now have a conference on future of Europe, how to rebuild a Europe with have a kind of constitutional convention for Europe, and working on a new constitution for Europe that will help to solve this problem. These are the overlapping institutions of Europe. You can see it's quite complicated, and you're going to have you have these overlapping jurisdictions, but in Macau, you know what that means. Macau has its own currency, but it's not exactly a sovereign country. But it's unusual for a country or a group that's not a sovereign country to have its own sovereign currency. There's a lot of interesting things. So this kind of overlapping jurisdiction problem that Europe has will go on, because there's the European Union, and then there's the Euro area. Of 27 members of the European Union, 17 in the Euro area. Maybe 5 or 6 or 7 of them will come into the European Union after the crisis, the debt crisis is over. They'll come into it. But the big one, Britain, is likely to stay out probably for at least another 10 years. I don't see Britain coming in for the next 10 years. Now what I want to do and close on is talk about the international problems, because I mentioned that the swings in the dollar-euro exchange rate had an impact on the crisis, certainly in the United States, and then certainly in China and Hong Kong and Macau. But there has to be something in the long run, because what we've had, if you look back after the war, after World War II, there was a period, there was an international monetary system based on fixed exchange rates. They were all fixed to the US dollar, and the dollar was fixed to gold. Convertibility of the dollar into gold for foreign central banks. So that was a very good system. But it didn't last too long. The US in 1948 had 70% of the world's stock of monetary gold. But by 1971, it has sold 40% of that to Europe. So Europe's got 40% of the world's monetary gold stock now, and the U.S. has only got about 25%. So now the U.S. stopped converting the dollar into gold, and then that broke up the system, and we haven't got back to one. We need to get back to another one, but it's hard to do because of the way the systems are. You look back at these. There was the internet from in the 19th century, the last part of the 19th century. There was bimetallism before that, before 1873, and then the Bretton Woods system came after 1941. After all the countries met in 1944 at Bretton Woods is a little city near a mountain, Mount Washington, in New Hampshire, in New England. And that set up the International Monetary System and the World Bank, those institutions. But now, those institutions don't do the jobs they need to do now, and we need to really revise them and do it in different ways. We had a period of flexible exchange rates from 72 to 99, and then I call it a new system because of the creation of the euro. Why, over this period, the dollar was king, the centerpiece of the system. And still in this period, the dollar was the central pivot of the system, but now it's split between the dollar and the euro, and that's undermined and weakened the role of the dollar as the big currency. So the half of this is being taken over by Europe. Well, that's what the gold standard was like in 1910. We don't need to go into that. But this is what I wanted to mention about the crises. Since the system broke down in 1971 and 73, you had the savings and loan crisis of the United States, but it had international repercussions. You had the international debt crisis. All the developing countries were cut out of the market in 1982. And that was caused by big swings between the dollar. The dollar went down, and then the dollar soared in the first half of the 1980s, bankrupting all those countries that had borrowed from the United States. And that was cut out the developing countries for almost a decade, until the early 1990s. And then Asian crisis in 1997 and 98. People say the IMF said that was caused by crony capitalism. That's just nonsense, because there's always croniness in business to a certain extent. But it didn't start in the 1990s and didn't end there. What caused the crisis was the fact that the big swings of the two major in exchange rates of the major countries. The two major currencies in Asia were the Japanese yen in the 1980s and the 1990s and the Chinese yuan. China devalued in 1994. The dollar was 5.5, and in 1994, January 1, it went up to 8.7, and then came down to 8.3. Later. But the devaluation of the Chinese currency followed after 1995 by the depreciation of the yen. The dollar had fallen to 80 78 actually, 78 yen in 1995, in April 1995. I was in China at that time. And, but by 1998, the dollar had soared to 148 yen. So in 1997-98, you have the Chinese currency with some devaluation, and you have in the United States, in Japan, depreciation. So all those countries that had kept their currencies tied to the dollar, which was soaring over this period, were knocked off. It was caused by big swings in exchange rates. And as I just mentioned, coming up to 2008, the big problem for the United States and partly of Asia was again swings in exchange rates. So correcting this is the thing to do. This is what the dollar standard looked like, tied to the US dollar with gold, the yellow part being gold in it. That system broke down, and then this is the system that we have now. Now this is what this is the way the world moved with flexible exchange rates. Over in the right, you see the European countries, but no monetary power collected together. There was a kind of DM area, but it wasn't a really thing. You got gyrating exchange rates. This is the problem now. Now this is the way the monetary system looks like. That's the chart I put on in the beginning, but but this is the way it is now. But because of the big problem of the swings in the dollar-euro, this is I call it the euros before the dollar. Before the euro, in 1999, which came into being, there was the ECU, the European Currency Unit. And so this is not, I put quotation marks of euros per dollar because before 1999 it wasn't the euro, but it was the ECU. And the ECU merged and became the euro in 1999. But this is the swings in the exchange rate. So you notice these big swings in the two major currency blocks in the world in the 1970s and the 1980s and today. And it's to eliminate those swings that you could have a model where you take the dollar and the euro, stabilize them at $1.30, more or less where it is now. And I've been saying this for a couple of years, and that seems to be a good rate to keep the dollar and euro at. And then, because China likes to keep its currency tied to the dollar anyway, let China do it. When China's currency becomes convertible, it can come along and make a kind of cooperative agreement with the dollar-euro area, and you have the three main with only fixing two exchange rates, the dollar-euro rate and the dollar-RMB rate. You've got 50% of the world on a fixed exchange rate system again, and you just need to get the central banks, the three central banks and finance ministers to cooperate in keeping them fixed again, and that would be a wonderful thing for Macau because its currency is tied to the Hong Kong dollar and Hong Kong is tied to the euro. But if it was tied to the euro as well, then it would eliminate those big swings that China and Hong Kong and Macau find whenever there's swings in the dollar-euro rate. So it would be a win-win, and it would be a benefit to every country in the world because they have an anchor that's now, the dollar alone is better than nothing, but it's not a good anchor because of the swings with the euro. But when you tie these two together and then add China to it, it becomes a win-win situation and points the way for a genuine international monetary system. And I think the possibility of actually moving toward and getting a global currency. And that's the reform that I think would be very desirable for the world economy. So this is the fix that we do it, and I want to talk about how that fix should take place. It's not as if under the Bretton Woods system, other countries kept their currencies tied to the dollar. That wouldn't work between the dollar and the euro because the two are close enough to being equals. But the U.S. could support the euro when it becomes low. When it gets down to, let's say, $1.28 or $1.25, and the European Central Bank could support the dollar when it gets up to $1.35. And then you'd have a range, work with and find managed policies to keep it within that range, and it would be a win-win situation. Certainly for the world economy, if you could get the United States to agree to it. I believe Europe would love the agreement. They would work toward it. They would like this agreement. And I believe Japan would like to come into that too. And I think it would be a very good thing for China. And the management of the central banks and cooperation around different policies, there'd be every instant to have a peaceful world and peaceful cooperation that would lead to a better political framework for the world economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mandel. Thank you very much. I'm sure there are many questions that you would like to ask Professor Mandel. Therefore, we will now take questions from you. For the Q&A session, we would like to invite Professor Ricardo Seal of the Faculty of Business Administration to the stage to moderate the session.
Very important issue, that crisis issues which are puzzling with the world economy in the past few years. Now we would like to entertain some questions. I'm sure that this is a very good opportunity for you to raise any questions from Professor Mandel. Okay, then, here.
Thank you, Mr. Mandel. You spoke about the European welfare state going too far. China and Macau are both preparing their own welfare system. So what kind of advice would you have for China and Macau not to overshoot as well? Thank you.
Well, I would set a floor minimum amount that would maybe subsistence survival, but people would have to contribute their own savings to it. I wouldn't rely only upon the government. That's what's got Europe into trouble. That's what's got the United States into trouble. Social Security in the United States came in 1935 and then gradually became generalized, and it cut down savings enormously because this was an alternative form of savings. In China, people typically relied upon the family and their children to support them when they got old. But with the one-child policy, that cut off that route of having a lot of children to support the family. It solved the population problem, but it created, so you got a huge increase in savings. And people then save, of course, a huge amount of the saving is corporate saving, and government's all private saving. But you got a big increase in savings as a result of that. So, but I think you have to have a floor so people are starving, they have enough when they get old, and that's going to be expensive for China with people moving into the cities without other means of support. It's going to, but we'll have to have a floor, but it can't be very large it can't be beyond what the economy can support. Now, China right now has got to a position where it's a very rich economy, saving a huge amount, and it's adding to its currency reserves, which is a kind of investment in external assets, very valuable. I think that a universal pension system also may be related to our amount of work. Will have to be done, but it'll have to be not go too far. If you have a fixed exchange rate, you have to coordinate monetary policies. You can't have an independent monetary policy and a fixed exchange rate. You have China today has a disequilibrium, a balance of payment surplus. Recently, the last two measures of cutting reserve requirements is a step in the direction of correcting that. that is pro-equilibrium. That's a good system, good movement. Much more needs to be done to do it, and I don't like the reserve requirements as a way of adjusting monetary policy particularly, but you can do that in China because it's a state banking system, it's not a private banking system. You couldn't do it with a commercial banking system because an increase of reserve requirements is a tax. And you can't vary that as up and down like anything else. But in a state banking system, you can do it. But my own view is that I made that proposal of about $1.30, and you can start with a band around it and see how that works over time, and see how monetary policies